Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So Assange here, Will, um, talking about his extradition hearing. And I will let you go. And I know you have some notes here about what's happening. And I guess a little bit of your notes are going to be what's not happening because COVID interrupted the trial yet again.
Yeah, that's right. So on Thursday, the hearings actually for Assange's extradition were paused. Wednesday was the last day we actually had any kind of deliberations or process because one of the lawyers on one of the teams, I think it was the prosecution side, one of the lawyers representing the U.S. Was there was a COVID scare where he possibly came in contact with someone, or I think he did come in contact with somebody who had COVID, and so they stopped the whole thing while he had a test to see if if he was infected. And ultimately, that came back negative, so that they will resume the hearings on Monday. However, yeah, we have not had anything happen since last Wednesday because of that. We had a pause in the proceedings.
I was trying to figure this out and I couldn't find anything, so I'm guessing nobody knows. But I'm just curious if you read anywhere what the plan would have been had the test came back positive. Just interested if they would then stop all proceedings for 2 weeks or how that will work. Just because if Assange's defense team needs a reason to adjourn, I mean, I'm sure you get enough people tested, one of them is going to come back positive eventually. And so if you're thorough enough about if you want to delay the trial, it seems like it could be a tactic that you could use.
Right, right. I did not see anything explicit about like what they intended to do should it had a positive diagnosis come back. But yeah, I assume they would have done like more contact tracing and paused the whole thing for a longer period. But here we just ended up with like a small little delay because of that.
Right. Okay. All right. So last week there was some pretty interesting testimony, and I think we did a fairly good job on the show talking about this stuff, especially from the first and the second day. I will say Scott Horton did an interview with I think his name is Cliven Smith. I'm missing part. He has like three names. I'm missing. I'm only got two of them.
Clive Stafford Smith, I think.
Yep, that guy. He's really good, and he testified at the Assange hearing. And so I will link to that episode of the Sky Horror Show along with that article we talked about from 9/11 on antiwar.com in the show notes page, which you can find at the Libertarian Institute. But Will, do you have anything else on Assange's trial? How anything's going, or any interesting hearings, or testimony, or updates that you've heard in the past week?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to start with that guy, that Clive Stafford Smith, his testimony. There was one interesting moment on the second day of the hearings where Stafford Smith got into this pretty heated argument with the prosecution. It was like a complicated legal matter. They were arguing about like how the case would be prosecuted in the U.S. I think there was a bunch of technicalities they were getting into, but it got very heated. And at one point, Assange actually interrupted and yelled, "This is nonsense," which is kind of a rare, like he doesn't talk very much throughout these trials, and for him to like have this outburst, like that was kind of an interesting rare thing. And the judge actually like chastised him and said like we'll kick you out of this courtroom if you if you have another outburst like that. And fortunately he did not get kicked out, but I thought that was just like an interesting, like that's one of the most contentious moments of the hearings I've seen so far, or read about so far I should say. I don't know if
Yeah.
you did you hear about that?
Yeah, I did. I guess the only part about that disappointed me is that was so much of the mainstream media's focus. At least from looking at like Reuters and AP, that was their headline pretty much for the whole week of
Right.
Assange's hearing. And this just has such a massive weight on journalism and especially national security journalism that you would think they'd be taking this a little bit more serious, but as we talked about last week, a big issue I have is it's really only the alternative media that's doing any like real diligent covering of this. If it wasn't for Consortium News and Kevin Gunstola and Craig Murray, we really wouldn't have a great idea of what the environment was in the courtroom and what was happening there.
Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, it should if you only got that little bit of information of his little outburst, like, yeah, that might kind of mislead you of what was said. I mean, Stafford Smith also got into some other interesting stuff about how Assange is actually exposing criminal acts by the U.S. government, and how he's saying that this has a clear, like, obvious public interest element to it, and that is part of what his leaking is. It's not as if he's doing this as like some kind of criminal hacker, who's making money off of it or something. He's saying no, this is all within the public interest because he's exposing evidence of criminal wrongdoing by the American government. And so I thought that was also an interesting part of his testimony.
Right. Well, I thought that that was interesting. I wish, and maybe I missed there just wasn't like somebody didn't quote this, but I thought he, should have said like, look at Assange's body of work. Like clearly, like the leaking, like these are principles held close to him. I feel like that's one of the nice things about us doing this show is if ever, we're ever in that position, we'd be like, look, this has nothing to do with money. We are making nothing. And we were out here saying like, hey, that, this information is important to get out there. And it's not about that. I think that's pretty clear in Assange's cases too. And so it's such a shame that there's just so little attention paid to it by the people who really do have, the most to lose. I mean, as much as it would more likely be used against somebody in the alternative or independent media versus like the mainstream media, the people who report the most national security leaks are, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, they're official leaks versus, Assange's leaks of information that's embarrassing to them and that exposes their war crimes. But still, it's a lot of the times the leads are published on the pages and a lot of these leads were published on the pages of the Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post. People want Pulitzers at these institutions for that, and yet now when that seems to all be on the line, they just shrug their shoulders and maybe chalk it up to what they call his personality issues, which are fake anyways.
Right, right. Yeah, all the fake controversy surrounding him and his alleged behaviors at the embassy and all the stuff just to make him radioactive. There was other interesting testimony on some of the other days. I think on day 3 we had this British professor Paul Rogers, who kind of got into like the political argument of just how like the charges against Assange are irrevocably wrapped up in politics, and how the American case against him is it's politically motivated. And that's been like a big part of the defense's argument. And I think that guy articulated it pretty well, this professor. We also had Trevor Timm, who made some of the points that you're just making about how what Assange is doing is not distinct from like what other news organizations do. And in fact, yeah, there was even a point during Timm's testimony when one of the prosecution people, James Lewis, actually questioned whether Assange was a journalist at all. And that's clearly nonsense. I mean, he's worked with some of the biggest, most prestigious, quote unquote, news organizations in the world, the New York Times and stuff. And yeah, it's done like award-winning work with them. So to suggest that he's like, I don't know, he is as much part of the media as they are. And, if not more, like he lives up to the ideals of journalistic, transparency and all this stuff better than they do even. But I think what the prosecution was arguing was that, because he, in certain cases, left certain names unredacted, that disqualified him from being a journalist at all. And I think Trevor Timm, his argument was that, even if you want to question that editorial decision, that does not make someone not a journalist. If you dispute an editorial decision they made, that doesn't disqualify them from, having protections that a reporter would have.
Right. Yeah, a couple things, I guess, that I have picked up on in the past week that I thought were interesting details. One was that this, not being familiar with the British court system, that this is going to be appealed and likely multiple times by whoever wins or loses, or whoever wants to get something, a different result here. So even if Assange ends up, his extradition is denied or granted or whatever after this, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the final result and say so in what's going on. And then the other thing is from my understanding, it is just this, there's not a jury, that this is like a judge making the decision. And so far she's been pretty hostile against Assange. And so yeah, I don't know why there's a reason to be very optimistic. And then the other thing is they're allowing very few people actually into the courtroom to observe, but they're only, giving out I guess live stream passwords and stuff like that. But from my understanding, a lot of people are having trouble logging in and the feeds don't stay live. The judge
revoked a lot of them too,
yeah,
I think.
I believe on the first or the second day, the judge threw out all the permissions that they had granted for people to be able to log in, and then they had to reapply, I guess, in a lot of cases. And so I guess it was granted again in a lot of cases, but still it's just extra government paperwork and hurdles. Will, anything else on Assange?
The last thing I want to say is just like we can look forward to in the coming days. I think maybe on Monday or Tuesday, we're going to hear Daniel Ellsberg testify, the great, anti-arms, activist, anti-nuclear weapons, and all, anti-war activist, as well as Patrick Coburn, the great British reporter. So definitely watch for that testimony, I'd say.
All right. Let's move